One demonstration. 60 seconds. That's all it took to shatter everything the world's deadliest combat instructors thought they knew about knife fighting. What happened in that Tel Aviv training facility on March 15, 2019, would force military academies across 17 nations to completely rewrite their close-quarters combat manuals. This is the story of how a quiet Filipino master, dismissed as a dancer by Israel's most feared combat trainer, proved that the deadliest techniques aren't always the ones that look the most brutal. This is the story of ancestral knowledge versus modern arrogance. And before this day ended, blood would be drawn, reputations would crumble, and the definition of effective combat would be changed forever. Tel Aviv, Israel, March 15, 2019. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete facade of the Wingate Institute for Physical Education and Sport. But this wasn't about sports. Not today. Inside Hall 7, a converted aircraft hangar reinforced with ballistic padding, 127 of the world's most dangerous men and women were gathering. This was the International Close Quarters Combat Symposium, held only once every 4 years. To receive an invitation meant you had proven yourself in actual combat, not in tournaments, not in demonstrations, but in life-or-death encounters where hesitation measured the difference between breathing and bleeding out. The roster read like a directory of global violence expertise. Colonel Dmitry Volkov from Russia's Spetsnaz, a man who'd seen combat in Chechnya, Georgia, and Syria. His close-quarters combat record included 14 confirmed knife kills. Master Sergeant James Razor Chen from the U.S. Marine Corps Martial Arts Program, who'd survived hand-to-hand combat in Fallujah and had trained 3 generations of force recon operators. Commandant Pierre Duchamp from France's GIGN, whose unit had resolved over 1,800 hostage situations, with a success rate that bordered on supernatural. And representing the host nation, Avi Goldstein. At 42 years old, Avi was a legend in the combat community. 6'1", 195 pounds of muscle sculpted through 25 years of relentless training and real-world application. His face bore the map of his experience, a scar above his left eye from a training accident in 1997, a slightly crooked nose broken in 3 places during various encounters, and eyes that had seen things most people only experience in nightmares. Avi hadn't just studied Krav Maga, he'd lived it, tested it, and refined it through actual combat. He'd served in the Yamam, Israel's elite counterterrorism unit, from 1995 to 2003. During those 8 years, he'd participated in 47 operations, including the rescue of hostages from a hijacked bus in 1998 and the neutralization of a terrorist cell in 2001 that had prevented a major attack on Tel Aviv. After leaving active service, Avi had become the lead instructor for IDF Special Forces units. He trained Sayeret Matkal operators, Shayetet 13 naval commandos, and Kidon operatives whose very existence Israel refused to acknowledge. His 3 books, Brutal Efficiency, The Warrior's Economy of Motion, and Surviving the Unsurvivable, were required reading in military academies from Fort Bragg to Hereford. His philosophy was simple, almost brutal in its clarity. In a real fight, you have 3 seconds, maybe 4 if you're lucky. Fancy techniques get you killed. Direct, simple, devastating, that's what keeps you alive. This philosophy had made Krav Maga the most widely adopted military combat system in the world. Over 500 law enforcement and military agencies had incorporated it into their training. It worked. Statistics proved it. Real-world encounters validated it. And Avi Goldstein was its prophet. As instructors filed into the observation hall, Avi held court near the coffee station, surrounded by admirers and colleagues. His voice carried across the room, confident and commanding. The problem with traditional martial arts, he was saying to a group of American instructors, is that they were designed for a world that no longer exists. Samurai swords, gone. Armor, gone. One-on-one duels following codes of honor never existed in real combat anyway. The instructors laughed, nodding in agreement. Modern threats require modern solutions, Avi continued. A terrorist doesn't care about your kata. A criminal trying to stab you won't wait for you to complete your elaborate disarm sequence. You need techniques that work under stress, in confined spaces, against committed attackers. That's Krav Maga. Everything else is museum pieces. At that moment, the Filipino delegation entered the hall. They were easy to miss. While other delegations announced themselves with military precision, crisp uniforms, formal bearing, deliberate presence, the Filipino group moved with a different quality. Quiet, almost invisible, like water flowing around stones. There were 3 of them. Master Reynaldo Santos, age 67, walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from a machete wound received during a tribal conflict in Mindanao in 1984. His hands were gnarled, calloused, marked by decades of weapon training. Maria Elena Cruz, 44, one of only 17 women invited to the symposium. She'd earned her place by surviving an attempted assassination in Manila in 2016, killing 2 attackers with an improvised weapon, a ballpoint pen, before her security detail could respond. And leading them, Carlos Mendez. At 38 years old, Carlos stood 5'9" and weighed 165 pounds. In a room full of warriors, he looked almost delicate. His training uniform was simple black cotton, unmarked by patches or insignias. His face was unremarkable, the kind you'd pass on the street without a second glance. But his hands told a different story. They were covered in small scars, the kind that come from thousands of hours of blade training. Not the clean scars of controlled practice, but the chaotic marks of full-contact stick and knife sparring. His knuckles had been broken and rehealed multiple times. His right thumb bent at a slight angle, the result of a fractured metacarpal that hadn't set quite right. These were the hands of someone who'd done the work. Carlos came from the Mendez family of Cebu, a lineage that had preserved Filipino martial arts through 7 generations. His great-great-grandfather, Lorenzo Mendez, had been a juramentado fighter during the Philippine Revolution against Spain in the 1890s, a warrior who'd sworn an oath to fight to the death against colonizers. Family records, preserved in a leather journal Carlos carried with him, documented Lorenzo's participation in the Battle of Balangiga in 1901, where Filipino fighters had killed 48 American soldiers in a surprise attack, many in close-quarters blade combat. Carlos's grandfather, Vicent, had been a guerrilla fighter during World War II, teaching jungle combat to resistance opposing the Japanese occupation. His techniques, how to move silently, how to kill sentries without sound, how to use improvised blades, had been documented by American OSS officers who'd worked with the Philippine resistance. Carlos's father, Roberto, had served as a combat instructor for the Philippine National Police. Over his 30-year career, he documented 247 actual knife encounters, not training scenarios but real attacks, real defenses, real outcomes. He'd survived 6 attempts on his life, 3 involving blades, 2 involving guns, 1 involving a grenade that had mercifully malfunctioned. And Carlos himself had tested these ancestral techniques in the modern world. As a security consultant, he trained bodyguards in Manila, Mexico City, Bogota, and Johannesburg, cities where violence wasn't theoretical. He'd been in 7 real encounters, all of which he'd survived, 5 of which had required him to actually deploy blade techniques under stress. But none of this was visible to the instructors in that Tel Aviv hall. They saw a small man with simple weapons and an exotic system from a distant island nation. As the Filipino delegation took their seats, Avi noticed them for the first time. His eyes scanned their weapons case, a collection of sticks, blades, and training implements. He leaned toward the Russian colonel sitting beside him. "Did they send the demonstration team by mistake?" Avi whispered, loud enough for others to hear. "I thought this was a tactical symposium, not a cultural performance." The Russian chuckled. Several nearby instructors smirked. Carlos, sitting 3 rows back, heard the comment. His expression didn't change. He'd heard variations of this dismissal for 20 years. Master Santos leaned close to Carlos and whispered in Tagalog, "Ang yabang niya, hayan mo lang. He's arrogant, just let it be." Carlos nodded slightly. "Ipapakita natin, we'll show them." The symposium's structure was straightforward. Each delegation would present their combat system's core principles, demonstrate key techniques, and then face questions from the assembled instructors. It was part academic conference, part proving ground. The morning sessions had been impressive. The Russians had demonstrated their brutal efficiency in confined spaces, techniques designed for fighting in submarines and armored vehicles where movement was restricted. The Americans had showcased their ground-fighting innovations, refined through thousands of combat deployments. The French had presented their hostage rescue methodology, backed by decades of successful operations. Then came the Filipino delegation's turn. Carlos stood, gathered his weapons, and walked to the demonstration area, a padded square marked on the floor 30 feet by 30 feet, surrounded by the seated instructors. He placed his weapons on a table. Several lengths of rattan stick in varying lengths, hardwood training knives, a training machete, and what looked like a simple piece of rope. "Good afternoon," Carlos began, his English clear but accented. "Today I will demonstrate the principles of Filipino blade combat, specifically the integration of." That's when Avi's scoff cut through the room like a blade itself. Every head turned. Avi was standing now, all 6'1" of him, his presence commanding instant attention. "Filipino knife fighting." The words dripped with skepticism. "With respect, Mr. Mendez," Avi continued, his voice carrying the authority of decades, "we're here to discuss combat systems that work in real-world scenarios. What you're about to show us, these elaborate stick patterns, these flashy blade demonstrations, they look impressive in exhibitions, but against a trained opponent, against someone who actually wants to kill you." He shook his head slowly. "It's dance, not combat." The room erupted. Uncomfortable murmurs rippled through the assembled instructors. Some nodded in agreement. They'd thought the same thing but hadn't wanted to say it. Others looked toward Carlos, waiting for his response. The Australian SAS instructor, Captain Mark Richardson, stood up. "Avi has a point. We've analyzed dozens of traditional martial arts for military application. Most don't translate to modern combat scenarios. Too many movements, too much ritual, not enough stress testing against resistant opponents." A German GSG-9 instructor added his voice. "In Frankfurt, we tested Filipino stickfighting against our standard issue asp baton techniques. The Filipino methods required too much space, too much time, against a determined attacker in a confined space. Impractical." Avi pressed his advantage, walking toward the center of the room. This wasn't just about Carlos anymore. This was about Avi's philosophy, his life's work, his certainty that he'd found the truth about combat. "I've spent my entire career stripping away the unnecessary," Avi declared, his voice rising. "Krav Maga works because it's brutal, direct, efficient. No forms, no kata, no performance. You attack the body's vulnerabilities, you neutralize threats, you survive." He pointed at Carlos's weapons. "These Filipino systems, they come from a different era, village warfare, tribal conflicts. They worked against opponents with similar weapons and similar training, but modern combat." Avi gestured to the diagrams on the screens behind him, showing Krav Maga's direct-line attacks, its brutal simplicity. "You need systems designed for today's threats, not historical reenactments, not museum pieces that look good on YouTube. The room was fully engaged now. This had become more than a presentation. It was a challenge, a clash of philosophies. Colonel Volkov, the Russian, stood up. I agree with efficiency, but I have question. In Spetsnaz, we study many systems before choosing what works. Goldstein, have you personally trained in Filipino arts? Have you tested them under pressure before dismissing? Aviv's jaw tightened slightly. I've seen enough demonstrations to understand their limitations. I don't need to spend years learning something that has obvious flaws. So no, Volkov said, sitting back down. You haven't tested it. Aviv's eyes flashed with irritation, but before he could respond, Carlos spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried across the hall with unexpected power. Mr. Goldstein. Everyone turned to Carlos, who hadn't moved from his position by the weapons table. You speak of efficiency, Carlos said calmly, of directness, of what works under stress. These are good principles. I agree with them completely. Aviv's expression shifted slightly. He hadn't expected agreement. Carlos continued, but you also speak of things you have not experienced. You dismiss systems you have not tested against resistant opponents. You assume that because something looks different from what you know, it must be inferior. Carlos picked up one of his training knives, a simple piece of hardwood carved to match the weight and balance of a real blade. My great-great-grandfather fought in the Philippine Revolution. He killed Spanish soldiers with blades like this. My grandfather taught guerrilla fighters who killed Japanese occupiers in close combat. My father documented 247 real knife encounters during his police career. I myself have used these techniques in 7 actual encounters. He paused, letting the numbers sink in. So when you call this dance, Mr. Goldstein, you are not just dismissing me. You are dismissing 7 generations of warriors who proved these techniques with their blood and their lives. The room had gone completely silent. Aviv's face flushed slightly. Anecdotes aren't evidence. Historical claims aren't proof. This is the 21st century. We have modern training methods, statistical analysis, documented combat results. Then let us test it, Carlos interrupted quietly. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended mid-strike. What? Aviv said. You say these techniques are dance, impractical against a trained opponent. I say they are battle-tested and effective. There is a simple way to determine who is correct. Carlos gestured to the demonstration area. Train with me, not full contact. We are not trying to injure each other, but resistant pressure testing. You attack the way you have trained. I defend and counter the way I have trained. We see what actually works when 2 committed practitioners engage. The Symposium director, Major David Cohen of the IDF, stood up quickly. Gentlemen, this is not a challenge match. We're here for education, not competition. But the damage was done. The challenge had been issued in front of 127 of the world's top combat instructors. Every person in that room knew what would happen to Aviv's reputation if he refused. Aviv looked at Carlos, really looked at him for the first time. The smaller man stood calmly, no aggression in his posture, no challenge in his expression, just quiet certainty. Aviv had 2 choices: back down and lose face, or accept and prove his point definitively. Fine, Aviv said, but let's establish parameters. What weapons? What rules? Your choice, Carlos said simply. You believe your system is superior. Choose the scenario where you are most confident. Aviv considered. His mind was already calculating. In Krav Maga knife defense, the principle was simple: control the weapon hand, deliver devastating counter-strikes, neutralize the threat. He'd taught this sequence thousands of times. He'd used it in real situations. Knife versus knife, Aviv said. Close range, confined space, the most common real-world scenario. Carlos nodded. Acceptable. Training knives only, Major Cohen interjected firmly. and I'm stopping this the moment I see anything that looks like it might cause actual injury." Both men agreed. What happened next would be dissected in military training facilities around the world for years to come. The demonstration area was cleared. Chairs were pushed back, creating a circle about 20 feet in diameter. This simulated a realistic confined space, a hallway, a small room, the interior of a vehicle. Someone handed both men training knives, hard rubber with weighted cores to simulate the feel of real blades. Avi took his weapon and immediately fell into a Krav Maga stance, left foot forward, weight distributed evenly, knife held in an ice-pick grip close to his body. His entire posture radiated controlled aggression. This was the stance of someone prepared to explode forward, to overwhelm an opponent with violent, direct action. Carlos took his weapon and relaxed. His stance was almost casual, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, training knife held loosely at his side. To the instructors watching, especially those unfamiliar with Filipino martial arts, he looked unprepared, vulnerable. Several instructors shifted uncomfortably. This was going to be ugly. Major Cohen stepped between them. "Rules, this is pressure testing, not a death match. First touch wins the exchange. We reset and go again. 5 exchanges total, understood?" Both men nodded. "Begin." Cohen stepped back. What happened in the next 60 seconds would be analyzed frame by frame, in training videos for years afterward. Avi exploded forward exactly as trained, a direct thrust toward Carlos's center mass, the kind of attack that in real combat would puncture a lung or slice through the liver. It was fast, committed, and potentially lethal. But Carlos wasn't there. His movement was so subtle that several instructors later swore he hadn't moved at all. A slight rotation of his hips, a minimal weight shift, and Avi's thrust passed through empty air, missing by perhaps 2 inches. In the same motion, so seamlessly that it appeared to be one continuous flow, Carlos's training knife traced a line across Avi's extended forearm. "Touch," Major Cohen called. Avi stepped back, surprised. He looked at his forearm where the rubber blade had contacted. In a real encounter, that would have been a severed artery. The room murmured. That had been fast. "Reset," Cohen called. Avi adjusted his strategy. The direct thrust hadn't worked, so he'd use feints. He'd trained for this, use deception, create openings, capitalize on hesitation. He feinted high, then drove low toward Carlos's abdomen. Carlos's response was even more minimal this time. His weapon hand moved in a small circle. Later analysis would show the motion was less than 8 inches in diameter. And suddenly, Avi's knife arm was trapped, controlled, and Carlos's blade was touching Avi's throat. "Touch," Cohen called again. This time, the murmurs were louder. "How did he?" someone started to ask. "Did you see that redirect?" Colonel Volkov was leaning forward intently. Avi was frustrated now, which was dangerous. Krav Maga trained practitioners to channel emotion into aggression, but this was different. This wasn't a compliant training partner or even a resistant one following predictable patterns. This was someone who seemed to exist in the spaces between movements. Avi changed tactics entirely. Instead of a committed thrust, he launched a rapid series of slashes, left, right, downward, upward, a whirlwind of steel designed to overwhelm through sheer volume of attack. This should have worked. Krav Maga's multiple attack sequences had been tested extensively. They created psychological pressure, forced defensive errors, opened targets. But Carlos moved through the attacks like water flowing around rocks. His footwork was extraordinary, small, precise steps that kept him just outside Avi's range while simultaneously positioning him for counters. His blade moved in tight, efficient circles, deflecting each of Avi's strikes with minimal force. And then, In a moment that several watching instructors would later describe as beautiful and terrible simultaneously, Carlos stepped inside Avi's guard. One moment Avi was attacking, confident in his aggressive sequence. The next moment Carlos was inside his reach, both men's weapons seemingly frozen. But Carlos's blade was against Avi's ribs, positioned for an upward thrust into the heart. Avi's blade was controlled by Carlos's empty hand, trapped and neutralized. "Touch," Cohen said quietly. This time the room was silent. Avi was breathing hard now, not from exertion but from the cognitive stress of facing something his training hadn't prepared him for. Every principle he'd built his career on, directness, aggression, overwhelming force, was being neutralized by someone who seemed to operate on different physical laws. "Again," Avi said, not waiting for Cohen's signal. He attacked with everything he had, a committed thrust combined with a grabbing attempt with his free hand, trying to trap Carlos's weapon arm while delivering his own strike. This time, Carlos didn't just defend. He flowed. That's the only word that captured it. His body moved in a way that seemed to violate physics, shoulders rotating independently of his hips, footwork that changed his facing without telegraphing, his weapon hand tracing paths that bent around Avi's defenses like water finding cracks in stone. In less than 2 seconds, Carlos had deflected Avi's thrust with a circular motion, trapped Avi's grabbing hand with a joint lock, so subtle most watchers missed it, stepped to Avi's blind side, positioned his blade at the base of Avi's skull, the position of maximum lethality. "Stop," Cohen said firmly. Avi stood in the center of the circle, chest heaving. He was one of the world's premier combat instructors, a man who had survived real violence, who had trained elite operators, and he was being completely dismantled by someone whose style he had mocked minutes earlier. The final exchange was the most educational. Instead of attacking, Avi decided to do something unexpected. He waited, falling into a defensive posture, making Carlos come to him. It was a smart tactical decision. Let Carlos commit, then counter his attack with superior timing and power. But Carlos didn't attack in any conventional sense. He advanced, but not directly. His footwork traced an angular pattern, constantly changing the angle of approach. His blade moved in small, lazy-looking circles that made it impossible to determine where an actual attack might come from. Avi tried to track the movements, to identify the pattern, to predict the attack. But there was no pattern, or rather, the pattern existed on a level of complexity his training hadn't addressed. Then Carlos did something that made several watching instructors gasp. He threw his knife. Not at Avi, that would have been easy to defend. He tossed it casually into the air, a spinning motion that pulled Avi's attention up for a fraction of a second. In that fraction of a second, Carlos closed the distance, caught the falling knife, and had it positioned against Avi's femoral artery before Avi could process what had happened. "Touch," Cohen said. The demonstration was over.